scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was in his study, engrossed in his newspaper. But the rustling of the pages sounded like dry, brittle wings. The antique globe on his desk spun slowly on its own, its continents shifting and blurring. A faint, musty smell filled the room. The ink on the newspaper began to bleed, forming strange, cryptic symbols. Daddy Pig seemed oblivious. The bookshelves appeared to lean precariously. A cold draft swept through the room. Peppa tiptoed to the study door. The familiar ticking of Daddy Pig /S watch had morphed into a slow, deliberate thumping. The air grew heavy. The symbols on the newspaper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Daddy Pig looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. He gestured towards the globe, which now pulsed with the same green light. The continents on it rearranged themselves into a map of an unknown, terrifying place. The books on the shelves began to fall. The study was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The thumping of the watch grew louder. The green light intensified. Daddy Pig rose from his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick with an unseen presence. The house was no longer a home, but a predator. The finality of her fate hung heavy in the air. The walls seemed to close in. There was no escape, no hope, only the hungry silence and the unblinking eye of their doom. The house had claimed its prize, and the game was over. For now.
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the Pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty. And on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George. And in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.
Peppa Pig, the new friend. One sunny morning, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when a strange piglet approached them. He had pale gray skin, odd eyes with a reddish tint, and a quiet, muffled voice. "Hi, I'm Simon," he said with a smile. "Hi, Simon." "Do you want to play with us?" Peppa asked cheerfully. Simon nodded, but his smile seemed a little off to Peppa. George also looked uneasy, but they decided Simon was just their new friend. At first, they played harmless games. Simon suggested hide and seek, but chose the strangest hiding places, like behind the trees where no one ever hid. When George tried to find him, he suddenly heard a whisper behind him, even though Simon should have been far away. "It's just a game," Simon said, stepping out from the shadows. By evening, things got even stranger. Simon asked to stay for dinner, and Mummy Pig invited him to join. "Are you from the next village?" Mummy Pig asked. "I'm from far away," Simon replied quietly, not taking his eyes off his plate. During dinner, he hardly ate, and instead stared at everyone, especially Peppa. After the family went to bed, Peppa noticed Simon still standing in the garden, staring at the house. The next day, Simon came back. He started inviting Peppa and George to play unsettling games. One game was called Look into the Dark. Simon led them into a dark corner of the shed and said, "Look closely. You'll see something interesting." But instead of something fun, Peppa felt a chilling cold, and Simon's shadow in the darkness seemed to move on its own. One evening, Peppa heard whispering outside her bedroom door. She cautiously peeked out and saw Simon standing in the hallway. His eyes were now glowing red. "Peppa, come with me. We'll be best friends forever," he whispered. Terrified, Peppa called for her parents, but when they arrived, Simon was gone. The next day, George disappeared. All they found was his toy dinosaur, abandoned in the garden. Simon appeared again and said, "Don't worry, he's with me. He's happy." Peppa realized Simon wasn't a friend, but something far more sinister. She tried to make him leave, but he just smiled and said, "You're next."
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa came downstairs for dinner to find her family already seated at the dining room table. But something was terribly wrong. They were all sitting perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. The table was set for dinner, but the plates contained food that Peppa didn't recognize. Dark, shapeless masses that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George all turned to look at her simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized like clockwork dolls. Their smiles were too wide, stretching across their faces in ways that looked painful, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Sit down, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "It's time for dinner." Peppa approached the table cautiously and saw that her chair was the only one without the strange, moving food. Instead, her plate held what looked like a normal meal, but as she got closer, she realized the food was arranged to spell out words, "Join US." The family continued to stare at her with those horrible smiles, waiting for her to sit down. When she hesitated, they all tilted their heads to the side at exactly the same angle, the movement creating a soft clicking sound like breaking bones. "Sit down, Peppa," they repeated, and this time their voices echoed strangely, as if coming from far away. Peppa noticed that the dining room seemed larger than usual, the walls stretching away into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead light. The family began to eat their strange food with mechanical movements, never breaking eye contact with her, never blinking. As they ate, their smiles grew even wider, and Peppa could see that their teeth had become sharp and pointed. The food on her plate began to rearrange itself, the letters changing to spell out new words, "Stay forever."
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, voices on the second floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the Pig family's house. The wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV.
It all began subtly. Peppa was the first to notice that her little brother George had changed. At first, it was just small things. He became quieter than usual, stopped laughing, and played less with his favorite dinosaur. He often sat on the floor by the window, tracing shapes on the carpet with his fingers. At first, Peppa thought it was just a game, but then she realized the shapes were always the same. Circles, and in the center of each, two long stretched eyes. "George, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to peek closer. But he didn't answer. His gaze was empty, as if he wasn't looking at the drawings at all, but sinking somewhere deep inside himself. With each passing day, it grew worse. George stopped responding to her words, ate less and less, and at night, Peppa heard him whispering strange words in his sleep. Sometimes he would get up and stand motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkness. One evening, he finally looked up at her, and Peppa's heart froze. His eyes were completely empty. The smile stretching across his face was unnatural, alien. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered in a low, hollow voice. One that didn't belong to her brother, but to someone older, someone else entirely. And after those words, he simply melted into the darkness. Peppa screamed, called for her parents, but they only said she must have had a nightmare. The next day, George returned. He sat at the table, eating porridge, as if nothing had happened. But when Peppa met his gaze, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You're next." On the floor lay his dinosaur, torn to pieces, threads sticking out, strange red marks on its body, as if clawed fingers had ripped through it. Peppa could no longer pretend nothing was happening. She noticed something else. In the hallway mirror, George's reflection lived its own life. When George himself sat still, the reflection turned its head and stared at her. Sometimes its lips moved, and one day, Peppa clearly heard, "He is already with us." No adult noticed anything. Mummy and Daddy said everything was fine, that George was healthy. But deep inside, Peppa felt it. Her brother was slipping away into somewhere else, and she was powerless to stop it. A few days later, He was gone for good. His bed was empty. On the pillow lay a piece of paper, the letters jagged and crooked. "He is with us now." Peppa clutched the note, her hands trembling. The house felt colder. The silence hung heavy and thick. That night she awoke to a strange sound. From the bathroom came a droning murmur, but it wasn't water. It was a melody, faint, hollow, as if played on an old radio. Peppa tiptoed down the hallway, each step echoing loudly. She pushed the bathroom door open and froze. Something was crawling out of the toilet. Its body writhed, slick with slime. Its eyes glowed red, and mingled with the bubbling sound was a dreadful melody. The same haunting tune, repeating again and again. Tralalelo, tralala. It seemed to sing, the sound spreading through the pipes, through the walls, straight into her head. Peppa gripped the doorframe, her whole body shaking. The creature was enormous, rising higher and higher, stretching its long arms toward her. Its head tilted to the side, moving slowly, and then it shook, as if to say, "You can't run." Peppa's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but no voice came out. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The thing slithered closer, its red eyes burning brighter, the melody swelling until it filled the entire house. Peppa stumbled back, step by step, until her back hit the wall. She knew this was connected to George. His disappearance, his words, the strange patterns on the floor. All of it led here. And then she saw him. On the shelf in the hallway sat Labubu, her favorite toy, always harmless before, but now his eyes glowed red and his smile was twisted. He didn't move, yet his gaze said clearly, "You're next." Peppa felt the cold seep inside her. She realized George had only been the first. Now it was her turn. Peppa Pig, The Cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's, Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. "You probably had a bad dream," said Mummy Pig gently. "Let's try to forget about it." But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then A voice, a whisper. "I'm almost out, don't turn around." The day was damp and overcast. Rain had fallen since morning, and only by evening did it subside, leaving the yard filled with shining puddles and wet grass. Peppa and George ran outside, jumping in the puddles, laughing, building a little tower of stones. Everything seemed ordinary. Inside the house smelled of dinner, and from the kitchen came Mummy Pig's voice. But when the sun finally disappeared, a strange sound drifted from the forest. It wasn't barking, nor the creak of wind. Heavy, dragging breaths, as if something enormous was slowly moving between the trees. Peppa stopped and peered into the thicket. There, in the shadows, stood a tall figure. At first she thought it was a deer, but its steps were too slow, too heavy. Each hoofbeat sent a shudder through the ground. And then Peppa saw the eyes, red, burning like embers in the dark. Massive antlers tangled with branches, as if the forest itself had grown through the creature. "Peppa!" George whispered, clutching her hand. The figure took a step forward. The ground trembled. The children screamed and rushed to the house. Daddy Pig flung open the door and pulled them inside, quickly locking the bolts. In the same moment, the silhouette loomed over the windows, and the antlers scraped across the roof, leaving long scars. The house grew cold, the air thickened, the lamps flickered. In the glass appeared not their familiar reflections, but shadows with crimson eyes. Mummy Pig clutched George, and Peppa felt the walls were breathing, letting in strange sounds. The whisper of branches, the crack of bark. The monster did not leave. It slowly circled the house. Each step left deep hoof prints, and those prints seemed to echo inside as well. The floor shuddered, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The house responded to every movement. Daddy Pig tried to draw the curtains, but the fabric clung to the glass. Beyond the window, there was no yard, only thicket, dense and endless. The moon broke through the branches, and between them, the red eyes flared again. The creature came closer. Its antlers struck the wall, and cracks spread through the wood. Shadows stretched out, forming shapes like hands. Peppa and George pressed themselves against their mother. "He won't leave," Peppa whispered. The monster loomed on every side. Its breath was heard everywhere, from beneath the floor, from the corridors, from the very roof. The air turned icy, and each breath came heavy, as if the house itself lived and breathed with it. In the living room, the light went out. In the darkness, only the eyes remained. They were outside and inside, seen in the windows, in the mirror, even in the black corners of the room. Daddy Pig grabbed the children's hands, but a step backward changed nothing. Behind them, the walls were no longer walls. Instead of wallpaper rose damp tree trunks, and roots pushed up through the floor. The house was turning into forest. Mummy Pig held George tight. Peppa clung to Daddy's hand. All four huddled in one corner, but corners no longer existed. The house dissolved, and the forest took its place. The whisper filled everything. It almost sounded like words, but none could be understood. Only one feeling remained. There was nowhere to go. The last thing the family saw was the creature's antlers breaking through the ceiling, and its red eyes reflecting in every window at once. Since then, no one has seen the pig family. Their house still stands in the same place, but on rainy evenings it seems to merge with the forest. Inside it smells of resin and damp bark. Stains darken the walls, and pine cones lie in the corners. They say sometimes through the glass you can glimpse reflections, not just empty rooms, but red eyes, unblinking and cold. And in the thicket near the house, children's voices are heard, calling for help. The deer monster no longer returns to the forest. Now he is here, and he waits. This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes, the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft, melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. "Hello there! Want to play?" Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. "You're really good at this," Peppa laughed. "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play," the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. "Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la," the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. "What on earth is happening?" Mummy Pig exclaimed. "I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. "Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family." It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, "Danger, aggressive shark inside." Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside, "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them, Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless song.